was like. So people could still do things. They could still save and launch a business and get something going, and that's how growth is created, even though the government's siphoning off a lot of capital and giving it to railroads or in subsidies and keeping out foreign goods and doing all that bad stuff. So I don't think we have to say, oh, therefore, must be all this, like some of the statists want to do. Robert Lively, I think, wants to do that and say, look, all this economic intervention led to this great growth. So what are you libertarians complaining about? I think we can answer that. The upshot of all this is that those people who use the word capitalism to include a lot of state intervention, I don't think are confused. I think they're, whether they know it or not, they have historical reasons to be doing this. This influenced, it didn't halt economic growth, but it certainly helped to shape economic growth by channeling capital. Kevin Carson calls this the subsidy of history. I think if we want to not sow confusion, we ought to be clear about what we want, and the term capitalism, and given this historical story, I think it reinforces this point, that capitalism does not communicate what I think we as libertarians want to communicate, so our job is tough enough as it is. Let's not confuse anything in the process. So I'll stop there. I know I probably went over time, and I assume there'll be some questions. Sorry I had so much to say.
So talking to the microphone for the video, but projecting it.
Hey Sheldon, can we go back to the beginning of the talk when you talked about economic freedom indices? It seems like the right inference to draw from that is capitalism versus socialism is a continuous variable, there's a whole range, and rather than doing what you were saying, thinking about it in binary terms, why not just think about it as something that can range from a high level to a low level? And then of course when you go back in history, you're never going to find that it was zero. So it's going to be easy to go back to the England during the enclosure period and find things that where the government was doing something. But still in terms of making the case, it seems like it makes sense to say there's more capitalist countries, less capitalist countries, and more capitalist ones did better. And their sins, though egregious from an absolute standard, were not that bad compared to other things that were going on. And you could have been talking about Russia during the same period as England was doing the enclosures, and then it is like night and day. So again, it does seem like a lot of the complaining about the early sins of industrialization and the relatively capitalist nations is not so much that people were complaining. That is, I don't think that really is the real complaint. The real goal is, I think, generally to undermine the reputation of the more capitalist systems. And in fact, if you could get rid of that, it still wouldn't really satisfy them. The thought experiment I suggest is go to someone like Gabriel Kolka and say, all right, so suppose that there was a society where we didn't have any government intervention. What do we think then? Well, we don't actually have to imagine, because he actually wrote about this in a letter to Recent Magazine when he was asked to join their panel of libertarian scholars. And he said, free market has never existed historically, and if it ever were established, you could count on me to favor its immediate abolition.
Okay, I think there's kind of two questions there. On the first part, I mean, I'd rather just talk about more free and less free markets rather than more capital. I just think it sows confusion, more capitalist and less capitalist. And I think it does I think it's associated in people's mind with things we really don't want to associate our ideal with, greed, for example. And I think for a lot of people that those things are associated in people's minds. So I don't see any loss in just jettisoning the word. I mean, we can talk about free markets. We can talk about laissez-faire. We probably have some other terms I haven't thought of that we've used. I don't know why we need this. It does suffer from some of the problems that Clarence Carson points out, right? I mean, if you can't call yourself a capitalist, I assume you're a teacher. You're probably not a capitalist. Maybe you are. But you would probably say you're pro-capitalist, but not a capitalist. So on the other part, well, you're right. There's some people who wouldn't convince anyway, but I don't think there's anything wrong with recognizing that at the dawn of this era, there was a terrible usurpation that occurred, and that it did. I think if you look at the Middle Ages as a time where there's progress going on, not totally a straight line upward, no problems, no reverses, but and I think that's the thinking these days. Certainly with a lot of people that libertarians respect, and historians who have, I mean, you find in Peter Bauer him talking about how the West is the product of 800 years of evolution. So what's he talking about? He's talking about the Middle Ages. And then the legal concepts that come out of it, the de facto rights, which then work their way into the jure rights. It seems to me that we can agree with Belloc that this, in a way, interrupted the progress that was going on when huge amounts of land were just taken by the crown, given to the nobility, and then a whole bunch of people who were establishing rights over a long period of time. I'm reading a book now called Lust for Liberty by a historian named Cohn about the Middle Ages, and the many uprisings, tax rebellions by peasants, fighting the impositions of the nobility and the crown in some cases, and fighting, on the ground for their freedoms. I think we should understand what happened. I mean, as a matter of historical understanding, it seems to me we should want to confront it and not gloss it over. I think we gloss it over. I mean, I hear lectures about the rise of the West that don't even mention it by our side, and it seems we leave ourselves open to intelligent criticism. What are you? You're wiping out a whole episode where the crown came in. In other words, it's the primitive accumulation thesis, really. But, of course, you like the free market. After they've distributed the land the way they liked it, they said, okay, starting now we'll have free market. I don't think we want to. We don't want to be ignorant of that tainted origin. It seems to me we ought to know it and disassociate ourselves from it, disapprove of it.
I mean, the question is just on a continuum, how tainted was it? 3% tainted, 5%, 50?
Well, I don't know how to guess it. I would think 3% sounds very low. 5% sounds very low. But and I have a lot more, study. I don't claim I'm an expert on the Middle Ages or the enclosures, but it seems to me important. Yes.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. They're handling the mic. I'm sorry. Yes. Hi, Jeff.
Sheldon, a question on your use of the term capitalism. John Taylor, in his 1821 book, Purity Unmasked, there's a book about U.S. tariff policy. And John Taylor was very explicit in bashing the capitalists as a basis for killing the American Republic early on. And there's some wonderful anti-capitalist rhetoric there, which might fit very well in your thesis. I'm wondering, as far as the use of the terms capitalism or market stuff like that, I'm wondering if there's, I wonder if the German terms might be more helpful as far as market Wirtschaft, market economy, or market order. Because as soon as you say free market, then if you have any government at all, then you say, well, it's not a free market. I'm just wondering if there's a way to get some terms that are less absolutist that might be more workable.
It's difficult to launch a new term because it's like money, right? You can start a new money tomorrow, but you got to get it accepted. And anytime somebody launches wants to launch a new term, it doesn't take. It seems like it's a tough process. I don't know. Free market sounds perfectly good to me. I'm comfortable with it. It's hard to mistake what you mean by that. I like that line. What part about free market don't you understand?
Well, but say for instance there's a single government regulation. I mean, I think you've got a valid point that there weren't real free markets back in the 1800s, but that's a little bit akin to the argument that a lot of the communists make. Well, Stalin wasn't a real communist, so you can't blame the failure of Russia against communism.
Well, that's an interesting thing, which some people on our side have written about. I mean, I know of people right here, George Mason, who say that there wasn't really central planning in the Soviet Union. There's a book I remember being recommended by, I think his name Peter Rutland, called The Myth of the Plan, where the plan was written, to reflect what had already happened. And they said, see, we met our plan, but they were reviving the plan to take into account, how many nails were produced and stuff like that. And then you had a lot of stuff going on subterranean, right? Managers trading from factories. I have too much of this stuff and you have too much of that, so let's trade. There's a show of a plan. I'm not saying it was a free market. It certainly wasn't. So what I'm saying is some socialists actually would have a point in saying, well, we didn't really give it a try. However, their problem is they did give it a try. War communism, they gave it a try, and it was a really dismal failure. So the reason they ended up not trying to ever recreate war communism was because it was so terrible. So we can get them on that count. Your point about Taylor is very good. We've had a couple of articles in the Freeman on Taylor by Joseph Stromberg. I mean, here's a guy, look, we complain about big government. Here's a guy in 1807 or something complaining about big government and saying, wait a second, Congress has gone way beyond the boundaries we were promised it would stay within under the Constitution. What's going on here?